Okay, so I'll do a little formal start if that's all right for everyone, just because I'm aware we've only got an hour for the discussion today. So welcome to today's lunchtime event, Photo Ethics. What is the role of social documentary practice in 2023? My name is Wewiora. I'm the head of social practice here at Open Eye Gallery, and I'm joined today by photographer Craig Easton and Open Eye Gallery's head of exhibitions, Mariama, Attah. So just some quick housekeeping rules for those that have just joined us. Please feel free to say hello and introduce yourself using the chat box so we know who you are. And please feel free to use the chat box to start asking questions or leaving comments when we do the Q&A section of the event. We'd ask if you can keep your mics on mute though, so that everybody else can hear everyone speaking. We also really do invite you to share your thoughts on our photo ethics discussion event today using your social media. So feel free to leave comments and just tag us in. Our handle is @OpenEyeGallery, and you can find us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. We will record the event today, so it is recording at the moment, which means that we can do a fully transcribed version of this discussion, and we'll make that available on our YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. So just to give a little context to today's discussion, Open Eye Gallery is currently showcasing Craig Easton Is Anybody Listening? So this is a touring exhibition from the University of Salford, which showcases two award-winning series of photographs, Bank Top and Thatcher's Children. Craig Easton Is Anybody Listening seeks to challenge typical stereotypes of northern communities through authentic representation and raises aspirations of young people within the region through an accompanying engagement programme called Our Time, Our Place, which is generously supported by the National Heritage Lottery Fund. I'd like to hand over to Craig to tell us a little bit more about his work before we start an in-conversation and Q&A between Craig, Mariama and you, our audience. So I'll just hand over to Craig now, if that's all right, Craig.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Liz, and thanks everyone. Hello, I'm going to share my screen just to start with. If I can remember how to do this. How's that look? Is that looking all right? Cool. So I just I'm not going to talk for very long, really. It's just a quick sort of introduction, because I do want to show you a few sort of installation shots from the show at the Open Eye Gallery, just so that those who have not seen it get an opportunity to know the context of the work that we're talking about. And I want to say that the reason we're having this discussion is because it's something we should all be interested in and something that we need to pay attention to, not just as photographers, but also as producers and curators and publishers and commissioners and editors. And, everybody's got a role to play here. And the discussion, as Liz says, is part of the engagement program surrounding this work. And I have to say, be very clear at the outset that I claim no authority at all to be speaking about photo ethics. I have as much to learn here as anybody, and have to sort of question my own approach as much as anybody. But I do think that I don't think my way of working is any better or any worse than anybody else, but I do think it's something important that we need to think about. We need to think about questions of ethics and representation when we're making work. So these are the install shots from Open Eye Gallery that show you, Is Anybody Listening is the sort of overarching title of the show. And as Liz says, it brings together two bodies of work. This is Bank Top downstairs, and then upstairs is Thatcher's Children. And whilst they're both distinct from each other, they do have kind of certain levels of crossover, and they're both made in the northwest of England, and Blackburn and Accrington and Darwin and places like that feature heavily in both projects. And I hope that they examine aspects of society and community and politics that I think bear some thinking about. And that's the purpose of making the work, really, is that they were made in response to media or political representations that I felt were sort of one-sided at best, and at worst downright dangerous and divisive. But beyond that, they are distinct, and in each case, I have worked with a writer or with the family, and I use words in the exhibition and in the books to bring context to it, to each project. So you can see here, this is Bank Top, and these are words by Aziz Hafiz, my kind of co-conspirator in this project, in which he used field notes that he took whilst we were walking around the community, and also quotes that I took from people that I worked with. And this work was made, it was commissioned by Blackburn Museum and Art Gallery, and was made in response to BBC Panorama programmes that described Blackburn as the most segregated town in Britain. And really, we thought that was, unfair, basically, and people of Blackburn were pretty upset about it and angry about it. And so in response to that, the museum there commissioned a number of people as part of a project called Kick Down the Barriers, to make work in Blackburn over an extended period of time, not to drop in for a couple of days and take some pictures or make a film, but to spend a bit longer there. And I think when we're looking at that, these are mostly shot as big, large format portraits made in the street. It was mostly made during COVID, so mostly it's out in the street. But I wanted to show them this way and to use Aziz's words to give it the context, and really to try and sort of counteract that sort of simplistic narrative that came from the Panorama programs. And I think whilst we're talking about ethics, it'll be interesting just to sort of muse on the idea of what were the ethics of Panorama when they made this program in the first place. Because with the sort of the idea that they can make a program or I can make photographs comes a responsibility, and I think we'll probably get on to talk about that. So that's the bank top work. These great big prints and quotes on the wall, and we can talk about why I make big prints and things like that. It's really, it's about ordinary people, and I want to show them in the best way we can. And then upstairs, Thatcher's Children was made very differently. This was a long-term engagement with one extended family over many years, and it was originally made again in response to the media and politics, because in 1992, those black and white pictures on the left-hand side there, in 1992, Peter Lilly made a speech at the Tory party conference in which he talked about benefit offenders and scroungers and spongers. And it was the idea that he was demonizing poor people as being architects of their own misfortune, and sort of blaming, this idea of victim blaming. And I think that was as offensive now as it is today. And this hideous phrase, the underclass, had come into sort of popular parlance. And we wanted to examine that. That's why the work was made in the first place. And photography, it was done for newspapers. This was a newspaper shoot, and I spent a few days there, and the pictures were used in a very quick way. And photography is really good at that kind of idea of a snapshot of society. Here it is right now. This is what it looks like today. So when I went back in 2016 and reconnected with the family, it gave me an opportunity, I think, to sort of set their experience in the wider context. So you can see on the walls here, there are quotes by the family, and in the book there are quotes by politicians, where we're sort of offsetting one against the other and saying, look, we're looking at this longer term experience of poverty and social deprivation in the context of social policy. So these are a couple of photographs from the book. I'm not going to talk for much longer because we want to get into the conversation. Both these books are available on my website if you're interested. There's a book of both projects, and they're done very differently. You can see that these are the interspersion of quotes from politicians and the family. And it's not all doom and gloom. I hope there's some sort of joyous pictures in there too. I try and make it a sort of rounded representation of their experience. It's not, they have a full range of sort of family activities, same as everybody else. And then Bank Top was done very differently. As I say, it was a series of portraits. And then bottom right-hand corner there is Aziz's field notes and quotes. So that's a flying overview of the whole thing. I don't want to go on too long, so shall I stop there and we can maybe get involved in the conversation?
Yeah, great. Yeah, great. Thank you, Craig. So yeah, please do feel free to start putting kind of comments and questions in the chat box. I've just got a few kind of initial questions to get the ball rolling basically, but then I'll keep an eye on the chat box to kind of ask those questions on your behalf. So a first one that I wanted to just kind of put to both yourself, Craig, and Mariama, is a kind of personal question. So what do you personally look for in good ethical practice in social documentary photography? So Craig, that's yourself as a practitioner creating the work, and Mariama, for yourself as a curator and head of exhibitions, that responsibility of how it's portrayed in the public and for the public. Craig, do you want to go first?
Would you like me to? Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think it's interesting that we talk about photo ethics and ethics in photography, and I don't think that they are divorced from any other ethical approach to society. You know, for me, I think it comes back to that idea that you know, treat others in the way that you would want to be treated yourself. And so I think I approach photography is the same thing. I hope that for me, ethical practice is about honesty and is about being clear about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And it's okay that, you know, I'm a photographer and I want to make this work, and explain to people why you're interested and what might happen with the work. You may exhibit it or show it in editorials or whatever. And I think that kind of openness is important, really. I mean, that's why I worked with the big camera in Bank Top, and it's why I spent such a long time with the family. That's, you know, I wasn't hiding the fact that I was a photographer and I was making work. And I think from that perspective, I think that's probably where the ethics come from, I think, in my own perspective.
Thank you, Craig. Mariama?
Yeah, I think I'll jump in. And I think even just hearing Craig answer that question shows that there is a really large overlap between how a practitioner and how a curator might approach this type of work. So again, for me, it's that idea of thinking, does the practitioner, does the photographer have the ability, can they explain how and why this work was created, or who they worked with, what those relationships looked like while they were making the work, and what's happening afterwards as well. So it's not just about having a set of framed prints on a wall, but thinking also about what is that legacy of the project and how does that involve the communities or the people as well. I think also just in a really practical sense, thinking about, is the photographer aware of their own strengths, but also their own limitations of working in this way? And Craig has said as himself that he's not an expert necessarily in this field. And I would absolutely say the same thing, but you don't have to be an expert to be working in this way, but you do have to be self-aware, or you do have to have an idea of what you need other people to bring to the project to make it stand in its own right as well. And then I think maybe a bit more specifically thinking about the curatorial angle or the curatorial approach, thinking about how do you then bring this work into a gallery, and what is needed in terms of interpretation or assistance or other material to make this work actually readable? How do you make this type of work legible, particularly if you're expecting an audience to come into the space and essentially do all the hard work for themselves? So reading or interpreting or understanding the political or the social backdrop to this work, what can you do to help people get into that work a little bit more easily?
Okay, thank you, Mariama. It kind of leads me to another question back at you, if that's all right. It just, in terms of that, we'll talk about that responsibility. So I think the themes that are covered in both Bank Top and Thatcher's Children are sensitive, but also really timely issues, particularly if we consider the current context that we're in the UK at the moment, and concerns around the cost of living crisis. So, you know, as an example, what considerations would you kind of want to put in place when exhibiting work which raises those sensitive issues, I guess?
Should I start with that? Well, I think even events like this are incredibly helpful, just in the sense of bringing other people's voices into that conversation. But I do think I also want to say that we are absolutely facing a cost of living crisis, but for some people, they have always been facing that crisis. This is not something that is new or novel, it's just new to a broader group of people. And so what does that mean when suddenly an outgroup or a minority or a small group of people who are quite invisible are suddenly brought into the spotlight? Or what does it mean to have some of those conversations that people have been having forever, but to kind of raise that to a greater platform as well? So I think, again, it really does come back to that interpretation, and also making sure that if we're showing this work in a gallery, for whatever reason that has been decided, making sure that people feel comfortable coming into a gallery and understanding, like, what is that position or what is the responsibility of a gallery. And I think it's really about demonstrating that, curating is about storytelling. And this is one angle or one approach of that story that we're sharing, but it's not possible to share everyone's stories on their behalves. And so that's why it's important to have these conversations, to have them online or to have them in the gallery, or to make people feel comfortable in sharing their own kind of experiences as well. But I think, yeah, absolutely, when it comes to the responsibility of curators and practitioners and galleries, there is always more that we can be doing. And so I think a part of that is also about listening or kind of taking on feedback from other people as well.
Thank you, Mariama. Craig, do you want to add into that, Paul?
Sure. Well, I mean, the question was about exhibiting the work and the sensitive issues around that. And I think Mariama's right. I mean, we had conversations about this. The idea of the sensitivity that you approach the work with, I hope, has been dealt with by photographers before it gets to the point of publishing and exhibiting the work. I disagree with you to some extent that it's a sensitive issue. I don't think it's a sensitive issue. I don't think racism or poverty or social deprivation are sensitive. I think they need to be out in the open. I think, those that want to sort of bury those issues under the carpet might want to present them as sensitive, but the issues themselves aren't sensitive. I think that the way we portray it and the way we handle the work and the people about whom we're making work has to be done sensitively. And the same again with, as Mariama said, I mean, yes, it can be timely. It's timely because of the cost of living crisis, but it has been timely every year for the last 40 years. I mean, this work, sadly, I think has probably had some relevance for a long, long time. And it's just because the work is out there now, people see it as timely. But, I dare say if I'd published it 5 years ago or 10 years ago, it might have been seen as timely then too.
Okay, thank you both. I know we have a couple. I actually know that Mariama and Craig have a question for each other, but I'm just wondering, do you want to hold that for now, because we've got quite a few questions that have already come in through the chat? Is that okay?
Sure.
And we can come back to those. Okay, so there's a first question from John Harrison, who just says, Craig, really interesting work. He's just a little bit more interested to hear about where the ideas for the Bangkok work came from, and specifically methodology of working with a writer, Aziz, and about that kind of conversation that happened between you both. So,
well, as I say, it came about in response to this BBC Panorama programme, and Blackburn Museum and Art Gallery invited a range of artists and writers to make work in Blackburn. So I think there was 8 of us in total. Aziz and I were both part of those 8. And I was making the work and had spent some time in Bangkok. Bangkok. I don't think I've ever said that. Not Bangkok at all. I spent some time there and was getting to know the community. And I didn't take photographs straight away. For a long time, I was just talking to people and say, how do you feel about this? The way, this place is portrayed. And then I started taking the pictures, and Aziz and I just struck up conversations about it, really, and about the wider context of the community and how the community came together, and how it had, instead of being a place of segregation, it was a place of congregation where people had come from all over the world. And I was very conscious, really, that as Mariama was just saying, that, we're using this work to explore a subject, and sometimes the pictures themselves are not enough. I come from a newspaper background. I've always worked with writers. And I think the context that a writer can bring to it is really critical. And I think the pictures influenced the way Aziz wrote, and Aziz's words and the conversations we had influenced the way I thought about the work too.
and Mariama, did you kind of feel similarly about having that writing involved in the curation of the show, in that way that you talked about before, about the idea of interpretation and multiple voices kind of representing a particular community?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is just a really nice example of seeing how you can literally bring other people's voices into the gallery as well. I mean, having the poet or having the poetry on the wall and having their stories or their sentences is just another layer to that type of interpretation as well. So I think the way that we talk about work is very particular as curators or as practitioners, and that's just not how people speak. That's not the type of vocabulary that people have when they're in galleries or looking at work or thinking about what it is that they like. So having different types or different approaches to the way that we describe work, the way that we think about the images that we see on the wall is really fundamental for curating, especially when the ambition or the purpose is to focus on storytelling.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple of questions actually quite similar, if that's all right to move on to next. So a question by Suzanne and Patricia. They're both just really interested, Craig, in how you broke that initial relationship or those conversations with the people that you want to be involved in your project, particularly with the Thatcher's Children project, because it was obviously quite intense working in one specific family. You know, and how do you keep that relationship going so that they feel comfortable with you in their kind of very personal environment, I guess?
Well, I mean, I suppose I don't keep the relationship going so that they feel comfortable. I keep the relationship going if they feel comfortable. And so it comes back to that idea that, you know, that I'm interested in the story and I'm looking at it and asking questions and listening and you know, I don't a lot of people ask me that they see a certain level of trust or intimacy in my photographs, and you know, and I don't consciously think of going out of my way to sort of build trust, other than the fact that I'm genuinely interested, and so I'm talking, and you know, and the same with Thatcher's Children work, that when I first re-met them again in 2016, I mean, it's not just one family, it's lots of families now, because they've all got kids of their own, but I originally went to show them the photographs from 1992 and say, listen, what happened? You know, did it pan out the way I imagined it might pan out? And so I really, at that stage, I was thinking of making a film, and I did a little bit of recording and I showed them the photographs, and it was a long time really before I got stuck into thinking, actually, there's a new piece of work to be made with audio and recordings and still photographs. So it's a tricky one, really. I mean, I suppose it's kind of, you know, it's a horrible word to use, but it's organic. It just happens. I didn't set out for it to be what it ended up being. I set out to explore something, and then lo and behold, 6 years later, it feels like it's a body of work that maybe has some questions to ask.
And similarly, Craig, how does it work when you're kind of wrapping up or finishing a project? I know that's something we are always thinking about when we do our kind of more socially engaged commissions, and we've got photographers working, you know, very collaborative in those settings for a duration of time. There's always that worry of the parachute in, parachute out, and what gets left behind is a legacy. So how does it work with what? It's another question from Suzanne about this idea of debriefing with the family. You know, how do you finish a project? How do you have that kind of reflection and evaluation time with them at the end around that as well, or is there something like that you do?
Well, with both projects and with most of my work, really, I'm sharing work along the way. So they see it developing, and I give them photographs and prints, and we're talking about it. And you know, and they always knew, both communities always knew there was an exhibition and book involved in this at the end. And in 2016, you know, we kind of thought the Thatcher's Children book would appear in 2018 or something. It didn't. It appeared in 2023 because it just took that much longer to do. And so, yeah, interesting. I don't know. I mean, there's an assumption in that question that the project is finished. I don't know if it is or not. You know, I think with both of them, it got to the point where I feel like we'd made work that asked questions that were ready to be answered, or to set down challenges to people. But I don't think it's necessarily finished. I think it's ongoing, not necessarily that project, but the conversations are ongoing. And sure, I mean, I sent them all a book as soon as the book was out, and you know, and I went back to with the bank top work. We're showing it here at Open Eye Gallery, but the very first show was in Blackburn. The first thing I did was show it in the community in Blackburn Museum in a much smaller, they were much, cheaper prints because we didn't have the budgets to do it the way we're doing it now. But it's important really to take it back to the community and say, look, this is the work I've made.
And have the families or the people involved come to see, have they been to see it in the gallery? Or because obviously I know this is part of a touring program, so it will be going to areas that in some cases are actually more local for them to go visit. But is there an aspiration or hope that people will come and see it in the gallery themselves if they would like to? I know obviously you've mentioned they've all received the book, and it's good to hear how they've reacted to the book as well.
Well, yes, in Banktop in Blackburn, a lot of the community came to the gallery, and some people came down to see it at Open Eye, and sure, it's there for everyone to see. I'm quite protective of the families involved in Thatcher's Children because we're using the work to make a political point, and they are. I'm not asking them to be spokespeople for this kind of thing. I'm not trying to put them on show in that sense. So they have the book and we talk and all that kind of thing, but I don't want to bring them into the gallery where they have to ask something. The conversations we had and the points we wanted to make about the experience and the relationship with politics is made in the work. It's I don't think it would be fair necessarily to ask people to stand up and talk about it.
Thank you. There's another question for Craig, but then I'd kind of like to hear from Mariama about it just quickly from the commissioner's side. So again, that idea of kind of the people involved in the project, like from the commissioner's perspective, what responsibility do kind of we have as a gallery about those ongoing conversations with those communities? Obviously, in some situations, we're receiving something that's touring, so we might have been a more arm's length partner. In other situations, we're working quite closely with those communities ourselves. So just be good to hear from that side of it, I guess.
Is that for me to answer?
Yes, please, Mariam.
Yeah, well, you're definitely right that we have more of an arm's length relationship on this project because it's touring and also because it's not necessarily set within our area. But this is the type of work that we do anyway. And Liz, this is something that you can obviously talk about like at great length as well anyway. But I think when you're taking on an exhibition or when you're showing an exhibition, whether it's a commission or a tour or not, there has to be some sense of all of the galleries in the world, of all of the curators, of all of the projects, of all of the practitioners, like, why are you showing it in this venue at this time? And I think we do have very strong links with various communities and various audiences in the city and in the region as well, who are able to have some kind of empathy, who are able to have some kind of synergy with the work as well. And I think through the program that we're doing, we're able to, I guess, make the work more relevant to people in the sense that these are issues that people are facing. It's not just a particular city, it's not just a particular group of people, it's not just a particular time that this is happening. This is something that will and does affect everyone. And I think art, particularly photography, just has a way of making that feel relevant or relatable to people as well. So the idea of how this project started as a commission, but then has evolved into something else, I think is something that obviously photographers can learn from as well. But there's also a model here for curators and thinking, how do you take a project that was initially set for a particular outset or a particular form, and then how do you shape that to sit in a gallery? Why is this being shown in a gallery? And what work do you have to do to kind of make that fit the needs of the gallery, but the needs of the audiences as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, like Mariama just mentioned as well, the kind of engagement program that's running alongside this with the kind of younger photographers is all about that. And it's about making those conversations relevant now and carrying on and thinking for photographers in the next generation about how they responsibly work and how they help represent the communities around them. So yeah, it's a model that we hope other galleries can kind of see as a useful model and a relevant model and kind of roll with that if they would like to. Thank you, Mariama. So there's a question from Laura Robertson for you again, Craig, which is, how has your own background and previous knowledge kind of shaped or coloured the work. She says she doesn't presume your class or background, but just more a kind of broader question around that, and what role do you think that has to play?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, actually. I mean, I suppose my background is I grew up in the northwest of England, and so I am familiar with these communities. I don't live in Blackburn, you know, it's 30 miles away or whatever. And but I became a photographer in the Thatcher years, and my outlook is shaped by the politics of that time. And, you know, and so the subject matter that I'm interested in investigating is kind of led by those concerns that I developed as a young man in the 80s. And you know, I mean, that comes on to questions that we've had before about the role of the outsider and the insider, and I think they're both kind of really valid in a sense. You know, I do not live I've not had the same kind of background as the Williams family and the Thatcher's children work, but I'm interested and angry about our kind of society that allows people to live like that, or forces people to live like that, to want to make work about it and want to bring those questions to the fore. And that comes down to the sort of ethics that we're talking about, isn't it? Is to, you know, who, I think one of your questions you were suggesting was about our right to make this work, or our responsibilities. And I feel very strongly that it's not a question of rights. You know, we all have a right to you know, comment on society and see people and speak to people and ask questions, but there is a responsibility for sure. And when we talk, I'm very aware that I, as a white British bloke or a white Western bloke, have, you know, come from the similar background to the people who have defined a lot of the visual culture globally for a long, long time, you know, and there is a privilege there. Of course, I come from a privileged background in terms of that, you know, and so, but it's not just enough to be aware of my privilege. I think you can't just write that off and say, okay, you know, I'm aware of my privilege, so I'm going to carry on making work. I think you also have to say, I'm making work from the standpoint of somebody who was socialized as a white British boy growing up in the Wirral, or, you know, as a white British man now. And although it's entirely valid for me to make that work, I think it's really important that people who are socialized differently to me are also able to make work, and the more the merrier. You know, I really want to see work made from the perspective of British Muslim women, or Angolan photographers coming to make work about, you know, Jodrell Bank, or whatever it is. You know, many of us have had the privilege of being able to make this work for a long, long time, and we need to really broaden that out.
Thank you. Mariama, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think I would say that I found the question of like who has the right to make this type of photography a bit difficult as well, and we can maybe spend a bit more time thinking about that. But I think absolutely, when it comes to the responsibility of the work that you make, no matter what the work is, there is a real inherent sense of what are you doing with this work and why have you made it? And really thinking about, does this need to be made? And are you making this on behalf of someone, or are you making this in collaboration, or kind of in connection or in relationship to other people as well? But I think the question of who has the right to make work is tricky, because on one hand, everyone has the right to make work about anything, because of course you do. This is, you know, I'm a curator. Curators are not police of the artistic sector, no matter what people might think about that. That's not how curators are working, or certainly not how they're working anymore. But I think when it comes to the rights of photographers making that type of work, if you're working with communities, I don't think you have the right to enter a community and to start a project and expect something in return. You don't have the right to expect collaboration. You don't have the right to people's stories without their permission, or their, you know, establishing a connection with them first. You don't have a right to have things given to you. But I think you do absolutely have the right to make work that you want to make. But there will always be people who will be asking you to justify your decisions for better or for worse. There will always be people, or should be people, asking you what process you've gone through, or what your thought process was, or how you've made the work, or where and why and how you've made the work. And that is just countering or kind of balancing that question of having the right to do essentially anything you want to do.
Yeah, definitely. And in a way, we're talking about photo ethics today, but it's like Craig mentioned, this broader idea of ethics. And it's almost like having that kind of ethical, checklist for yourself. Like, you want to be questioning yourselves about why you are making this type of work, and why as galleries we want to be presenting it. And I think it's about having that check-in with yourself, actually, but so that you feel you are comfortable with your own morals and ethics about what you're doing, how and why. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
If you find yourself shying away from those questions, or if people are asking you questions and you don't have an answer, or you feel like the work should just stand for itself, I think that is definitely a concern, and you really need to maybe reflect on the project or where you are today.
I think on that point, I think it's also really important to remember, and it's very important for young photographers to remember, that there's nothing wrong with being a photographer. We're only taking photographs, and you're absolutely right. We do have that responsibility, and we do need to treat people with respect and responsibility and all those kind of things. But I think it's critically important that we are all able to make work about. For me, photography, and I know there are other views of photography, but my own view is that it's an outward-looking medium. The way I work is it's an outward-looking thing. I'm making work about things, about society, about communities. And there are plenty of other people that have different views and have different approaches, and that's all cool. But I worry that if people become scared of making work about other communities or as an outsider, if you're scared of doing that, then inevitably you're going to make work about yourself or about your own experience. And I think we all lose if that's the case, because it seems like that's another step down this kind of no such thing as society, and we're all individuals and we only have our own individual experience. I worry that those that seek to divide us win if we can no longer make work about each other and share those stories.
Craig, I guess that really hits upon a point of how photography has changed, since the projects that you were doing, with the original Thatcher's Children series, to how everybody is using photography now. So I think there's broader questions around kind of like the role of social documentary practice adapting and changing to the role of photography now. If we think everybody can do that very individualized representation, we're on Instagram every day. So there's broader questions about how as photography is changing itself and how people are using it. We've got another question from Suzanne. There's also a question from Kit, actually, sorry. He's asked if Open Eye Gallery have had any particularly emotive responses to exhibition. Kit, the answer is yes. I saw one that was really emotive this morning in an email, so I will share that before the end of the session for you. But to go to Suzanne St. Clair's question, she says, when we talk about the role of social documentary photography and ethics, we can speak of it highlighting particular communities and it being this idea of a tool for change. So she was just interested to hear what, if any, feedback you had from the people that you worked with on Thatcher's Children and Bank Top and their experiences of being involved from that kind of perspective.
Well, I mean, I am in touch with a lot of people. I'm certainly in touch with all the families, and still see people in Bank Top, and I've had, to be honest, I've had a lovely response, and it's been very personal, and we've had some lovely conversations. And sure, I'm making work that is challenging, but people respect that, and they respect that I was honest in why I was making it. And and I hope certainly with Thatcher's Children, I'm not shying away from some of the difficult stuff there, but equally I'm trying to present the work in quite a sort of rounded way. And so yeah, I mean, I have got some lovely exchanges, I've had some lovely conversations, I've had some emails and things, And when I, after the Sony Awards, I went up to Banktop and they were mad at me because I hadn't told them I was coming because they wanted to have a street party and all that kind of thing. But do you know what? I mean, that's not why I'm making the work. I'm making the work because I'm trying to ask questions. And as long as I take people with me, the people I'm working with understand why it's being done, you know, beyond that, the sort of the personal sharing of stories afterwards is kind of personal between me and them, really.
Thank you. And again, a question that's kind of more to both of you from both sides of this actually is, Devs has said, however ethical you have been in making your work as a photographer, Craig, have you found that commissioners, how much impact might they have on how the work is finally represented? And to what extent does that maybe shift that idea of subject or the photographer's control over how it's presented and what's published?
Well, I mean, I've been fortunate. I haven't sort of run into those kind of problems where people want to misrepresent what I did. I think by and large, you know, publishers and commissioners and curators have been very supportive in the work I've been making, and you know, and also I'm quite bullshit. You know, I would really try not to let that happen. You know, because I know that when we first published the Thatcher's children work in the Guardian a couple of years ago, there was comments, and you know, when Aziz wrote about comments that were in the Daily Mail, when the Daily Mail ran stuff about the Sony Awards, and you know, there was just the usual crap that you would expect in the comment section. I was saying, don't read the comments, Aziz, and his response was, we pissed off the Daily Mail, we've done something right. So it's a funny one, really. I think you make the work because you're wanting to tell a story and challenge certain misconceptions. And I think I've been really lucky that mostly when it's published or when it's exhibited, people have been really respectful of that. And if they're not respectful, I have had to say no to certain things where they said, you know, can we do this or can we use that picture? No, you can't, because that's, you know, that's not there for publicity. But you know, I think we're all engaged in society and in this medium and having conversations around it, and most people are pretty respectful. I mean, that comes down to the ethics of the publishers and the curators and the editors, doesn't it? So, you know, that's what I said right at the beginning is, you know, conversations about photo ethics are not conversations about photographers' ethics. They're about, you know, conversations about ethics in the photo world, which includes all of us.
Mariama, do you want to add into that from the commissioner curator side of it as well?
Yeah, I think what I'll say is that essentially because of the way that we work, so working in a socially engaged way or working with social issues, when we're working with photographers, generally we are all trying to move towards the same thing. We're all trying to pull in the same direction of sharing stories, sharing projects in galleries with our audiences who we know well, in a location that we are like deeply invested in. So what that means is that if you have a relationship with the photographer that you're working with, and you absolutely have to have a relationship with them, that means that you're having conversations with people rather than having negotiations or discussions that are trying to kind of pull a project back into line. And so when we're showing work that is about, you know, socially engaged ideas or working with projects that have some kind of impact on society or on people, ideally, you already know the photographer because you've been having these conversations. So you're curating based on the strength of that relationship. And I think that is always apparent to see in the final exhibition.
Yeah, exactly, Mariam. And I think it's worth, you know, noting again that because this is touring, these are ongoing conversations. So, you know, every time it tours to a different venue in a different context, those conversations are happening about, you know, slightly different representations or versions of things that suit that community's context best. And this event, the photo ethics event, this is just the first of a series of these events that will happen again, that will be more relevant to the different locations and venues. So it's again about that idea of adapting and presenting things that are relevant to the locale. Thank you both. So Nauru had a question for you, Craig, about has it ever happened where you've approached a particular topic or subject matter or place with maybe one view in mind before you start a project? And have you found that view has maybe been challenged or changed, or your opinion has changed as you're kind of going through the process of engagement with working with people?
Certainly I've learned as projects have gone on, and you know, the work that I set out to do is to ask some questions, and those questions change, and I get different answers and move in different directions. But I try really, really hard not to go in with an agenda and say, I'm going to make work about X because it's this. I go in with a question. And in really, the Blackburn work was made precisely because we felt that the Panorama had gone in with the idea that this was a segregated town and they were going to present it in that way. So my starting point was, how do you feel about this? And can I learn, you know, how we're going to present it? So yes, as through the course of making that work, it became about social policy, it became about international policy, it became about colonialism, and it became about the textile trade, and it became about all these other aspects to it, which, you know, I dug around and read about and talked to Aziz about whilst we're making the work. So yes, the work that ends up at a final project is very different to what I necessarily thought it might be at the start. However, it's not so simplistic that I go in and say, I'm going to make work that sort of, you know, demolishes this thought or confirms this thought. I hope I go in with as much of an open mind as possible.
Thank you. And then kind of following on from that, how do you reckon, or how do you think photographers should navigate social boundaries? And this might also be a question for yourself, Mariama, from a curator perspective. So whether that's race, gender, sexuality, or class, when representing subjects ethically. And do you think the process can be as important to the work as the distribution of the photographs themselves? So yeah, Craig, do you want to go first with that one?
So run that by me again.
So it's two-parter. So it's, how do you think photographers should navigate social boundaries when representing subjects ethically?
Oh, that's interesting. That, you know, the reason we made the work in Bank Top was because it was called Kick Down the Barriers. It might be called Kick Down the Boundaries. You know, who decides what the social boundaries are? You know, that comes back to my point I tried to make before, really, which is understanding my own, you know, position in the world as a you know, a 55-year-old white bloke from Merseyside. That I realize I'm coming at it from that perspective, but I don't think there are boundaries that are, you know, that prevent me from talking to people and asking and wanting to share other people's experiences and learn. So I hope, again, I go with an open mind, and I think it's really important not to shy away actually from making work about other communities, because the reason I'm a photographer is you know, we've talked before, Liz, you know, there are different ways of being socially engaged, and, you know, and this community and co-authorship and those kind of things is brilliant, and it works in a certain thing. And there's, you know, I would argue that I'm socially engaged, but don't necessarily co-author the photographs. I collaborate with other people. But the social engagement is actually saying, well, can we look at these boundaries and see whether we can, you know, find common ground between us, I suppose.
And I guess that's part of where the kind of other part of that question was leaning towards, is that idea of, do you think the process can be as important to the work as the distribution of the photograph? So that process of engagement that you obviously are having with those people in those kind of portrait encounters.
Yes and no, I suppose. I mean, the process dictates how the work is made. So, you know, I very deliberately chose to work on a big plate camera in a very visible way in Bank Top, and so I guess the outcome was dictated to some extent by the process. But maybe the process was chosen because it was, I don't know. You know, it's I don't really know how you square that one. That, you know, the process is important in as much as it dictates what comes out, but I don't think the process is enough in itself. I think the outcome is critical, because that's the thing that you share, and that's how you reach audiences. And it's really important for me to reach as wide an audience as possible so that people can engage with the you know, the subject of the work.
And how about yourself, Mariama? Because I know at the gallery we're always thinking about it on the flip side. You know, we're very used to being the gallery that presents the work, but actually it's about how do we present that process, or sometimes it's works in progress, or those conversations that obviously must have happened for that work to be on those gallery walls. So
yeah, I think it really depends on the specific project. So in this case, like the outcome is the process, that is the artistic process, or that is where the artistic merit is sitting. But for a lot of projects that are working in like a socially engaged way or working with communities, it is that community relationship that is the process, that is the artistic process of meeting people, of collaborating, of co-authoring, of sharing photography and how to take photographs, or how to print or make or tell their own stories. And that is, in a lot of cases, that is the artistic process. And the issue, or the strength of that, or the particular way of working in that sense, is that it isn't public. And so again, you have to think about like who is the audience, or who is the work for? Because a lot of the time the merit sits with the people who are taking part in that project, but that isn't necessarily widely visible. And I think one of the things that we always say at the gallery is that most of the work that we do is outside of the gallery. So that's happening in people's community spaces, in their homes, online, in person, wherever. But we know that lots of people don't feel comfortable coming into galleries. And so that is why the majority of the work that we do is outside of the gallery. But for the people who do want to come to the gallery, or for those communities who do want their work in the gallery, and there are lots of reasons why that's the case as well, we're able to do like either one or both, or some kind of combination of that. But I do think in a lot of cases, that establishing those communities, of forming those links, of showing people that they already possess those skills to tell those stories themselves, that for a lot of socially engaged projects, that is the artistic process in itself.
Thank you. We've got a question from Dan Carter, who says, to what extent could an outsider photographer be responsible for supporting their participants in challenging injustice or unfair circumstances? Go on, Craig, I'll give you that.
Well, again, I think there are different approaches. You know, there are photographers who want to work with communities and make community work and show it in the community. There are photographers who want to make work in communities in order to try and ask questions about it and challenge notions and get conversations going. And there are photographers who would consider themselves to be campaigning photographers. And all of those are entirely valid. Polemy Basu's work that she does is properly campaigning, as she uses her photographs to campaign for something. Now, I don't think I am doing that. I think I'm making work about a subject that I think needs to be aired and needs to be talked about. But I'm certainly not promising that the work I make with a family that, may be challenged in kind of poverty or cost of living or something, the work I make isn't going to help that on an individual level. The work I'm making is to start conversations and say to us, is this the kind of society we want to live in? I think the idea that a question we often get asked, can photography change the world? You think, oh, come on, give me a break. It's not. I want to make work because I want to be engaged with it, but to set the bar so high that photography is only valid if it has an immediate impact on changing the world is crazy for me. I think it's really important to be able to. I know that wasn't the question, but there are different aspects, different ways of working with communities, and I totally respect people who want to campaign and use their work to campaign.
I guess as a follow-on for that as well, is it again, it's coming back to this term that we've used a few times, like this idea of the outsider and the outsider photographer. There's a question from Dulce that says, essentially is kind of asking, how does a photographer approach document an experience that they might not personally understand or have experienced themselves? You've probably touched on this already, Craig, but just anything else you wanted to add around that?
Well, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Maybe you're not making work about an experience. Maybe you're making work about a context. And so, sure, I'm not making work specifically about the experience of poverty. I'm making work that, and that's why the family is quoted in the book. I spoke to them a lot to find out about their experience, because I don't have that experience. But what I do have is an ability to share their experience and juxtapose it against the experience or the words of politicians who talk about them a lot. So I'm working with families that are talked about a lot and very rarely listened to. And so my job, as I see it, is that, perhaps I can go in and sort of put those two things together. It's not necessary for me to have had that experience in order to be able to make work about the wider context, I don't think.
Okay, thank you. I'm aware of time. We've only got a little few minutes left, but there's a couple more questions that are kind of similar from people. If I just sort of summarize, if people don't mind me doing that, just to get them through. One is around this idea of consent. So from a very practical point, ideas are kind of about model release forms or written or verbal consent, and your kind of approach to gaining that when you work with participants, Craig. And also that idea about, well, we talk about this a lot in socially engaged projects, that consent isn't just a one done thing. It's kind of an ongoing conversation, because people have that right to change their mind, or actually they may be happy to have a body of work made, but certain images, it's not right for public, for the public profile of the work. So anything you've got around consent from yourself, Craig, and Mariama, would be really helpful.
Well, in both projects, there are pictures that we have not shown for precisely that reason. But no, I did not ask for consent forms. I mean, it was very clear that I was a photographer. I go right back to our first question, that I was making this work very openly, and people knew what I was doing with it. And I don't think those kind of consent forms are, as you say, are adequate. You can't just have a consent form and think that gives you a right to do whatever you like. It's an ongoing process, and so I'm deeply involved with the family and I've worked with him for a long time, and it is understood that I'm making the work, and the consent has been given. And I think we didn't touch on this, but there's lots of things that, how things have changed over the years, that people talk about consent forms, and people are really, I do worry that we get too bogged down in the ethics, that it's going to stop people making work about communities other than themselves. And I think it's really important that we're able to do that, but we do it honestly and carefully. There's a show that's just finished at the Photographers Gallery. Two great heroes of mine, Chris Killip and Paul Strand, both photographed with a camera with a right angle lens. Nobody would do that now. But we're still showing it in the Photographers Gallery, and we should maybe just be aware of that as is anybody debating whether that was ethical? I don't know if they are.
Mariama, do you want to add?
One?
Yeah, Mariama, do you want to add into that?
Yeah, no, I'm certain there are people debating the ethics and the questionable nature of that work. But I think people will always make work, no matter what happens, no matter if they feel like they should be making that work or not. People will always be photographing other communities. We can look at the work that, as curators, as producers, as practitioners, we are always, shortlisting or selecting works. And you see huge amounts of bodies of works and projects where people are going into other communities and photographing other people. I truly do not believe that there will ever be a point in photography where all of that will cease, for better or for worse. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I truly don't think that there will ever come a time where that type of approach will stop completely. And I completely understand what you're saying, Craig, about people shouldn't be scared to photograph people if you don't exactly mirror that person or that community. And there absolutely is a role and a reason and a space and a place to do that. And I think the way that you do that is through collaboration. So you can only ever have the thoughts that you can have. You can only ever have the experiences that you can have. You can't live outside of yourself, but you can do that through collaborating with people. And that is how you meet other communities. That is how you move into other spaces. That is how you photograph people who are not anything like you. I imagine the world would be a really dull place if people were just photographing essentially themselves or like a mirrored version of themselves. But I also don't think that is ever going to happen as well. But I do think that it's a good thing to question why you are doing the things that you're doing, not to put people off, but to say, of all the things that you could photograph, of all the people that you could be working with, of all the collaborations or the partnerships, why this? I think that is a fundamental and should be quite an easy question to ask yourself as well. And I think that is what makes photography interesting, because of how quick it can be, because of how easy it is to share. There are real like beauties and intricacies of photography that other mediums just don't have to answer in that same way.
Thank you, Mariama. And with my head of social practice hat on, for the person that asked the question about model release and consents, if there are minors, then yes, 100%, please get your model release consent, because somebody could refuse to use that image or show that image if they've not got it from someone who's under the age of 18. So I think we've got one more quick question I can get in. This one's from Mariama. This is around kind of the idea of impact and who we're trying to kind of get the message across to. So actually it's to the both of you, but it's a question around space and the role of the gallery. So for example, if you were to consider making the work for public realm, do you think that might have more impact in terms of the idea of getting that message across that you're wanting to talk about when you take it, outside of the gallery environment and on the high street? And who might be engaging with those conversations when you do that, and any ethics around that as well, actually.
Yeah, like I completely understand overall what the question is asking, but I think like the question that I want to answer is like, what is it that you mean by impact? Because if you mean like number of people who are coming to a gallery, or number of people who will see the work, or those are different answers. Or are you looking for something that is like more meaningful or like has a greater depth of engagement? I think when we are thinking about why is an exhibition being shown in a gallery rather than the outside of the gallery, or in the public space outside the gallery, or in truly public spaces, or online, or in people's homes, there's a reason why all of these platforms exist. And essentially, there are not enough galleries in the world to support all of the projects in the world. You can't expect to see every exhibition in a gallery, and not all exhibitions or projects are fit for a gallery as well. During lockdown, when galleries are closed, the art sector did not stop. People didn't stop making art. Projects didn't cease to exist. There are so many other platforms that projects can exist in, and I definitely suggest and encourage people to think beyond the gallery as well. There are only so many exhibitions and so many artists that we can support in a gallery every year. So if you are showing work in public realm, of course that has an incredible impact on people who don't come to galleries or who don't want to go out of their way to come to us. And in a sense, we do have a responsibility to go to people instead of expecting them to come to us and where we are. But again, it's not possible in every aspect. We have to think about, what is the subject? Can we interpret the work quickly enough for people to understand what it is that they're looking at as they walk past? Does the work make sense to be in a public space? Is there enough space? Can you work to scale? All of these outputs make sense when you put them together. I don't think it makes sense to kind of pull them apart and to only show work in one style or in one place.
Great, thank you, Mariama. Craig, did you want to add into that at all? I know me and you have worked on a project that's had every version of every showcase you can imaginable, public realm, gallery, online.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would inevitably, you would expect me to challenge the idea that there is a message. There's not really a message, there's a question. And if you're I'm not trying to give out a message, I'm trying to ask questions. And if I'm trying to ask questions, I want to find as many platforms for that as possible. And yes, you do need to be sensitive about where you show it, but each place brings a different audience. I show it in a magazine, I show it online, I show it in a gallery, I show it in the public realm, I show it on Newsnight or whatever. And each of those just broadens the audience and broadens the conversation. And I think that's a good thing, certainly in terms of the kind of questions I want to ask.
Thank you. Mariama and Craig, I know you had a question for each other. Do you think it's been answered already, or would you still like to ask your final question to each other?
Well, I don't know. We could go on for a long time, couldn't we, Mariama? So maybe it's a bit short now. It's 1:05, so maybe we save it for another one. But
yeah, should we free people?
Yeah.
Free people. Okay. Well, with that, as promised, I just wanted to finish then with the quote. I think this was Kit had asked earlier, well, had there been any particular emotive responses to the show that's currently on at Open Eye Gallery? So I've just put that in the chat for you, but I'll read it out loud as well. Superb portraiture. The subjects obviously have absolute trust and confidence in the photographer. There is openness and frankness in their faces. They seem to say, this is who I am, and I'm pleased to let you know me. I've never been to a more moving photographic exhibition. Thank you. So that's one that we just we typed up literally on the weekend. So that might be a nice one to kind of round up with. Apologies if I didn't get through all of your questions. I think I did. So apologies, I missed a couple at the end. But you can always kind of email me and I can try and pass those on if need be. I'll put my email in the chat for you. So can I just do a big thank you to Mariama and Craig for joining me for the discussion today. And a huge thank you for all of you attending today and for all your kind of really interesting and relevant comments and questions, which were, super on point, challenging, and yeah, I think made for a really rich conversation. So thank you all so much. And we'll pop this online in a couple of weeks. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks all. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.